Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle. And I'm not sure if this video is going to see the light of day, but I thought I'd film just kind of a rant style video just to see if it's worth putting out there. I have some thoughts that I'm thinking through based on some recent videos that I've seen and discussions with my fellow friends in this space, and just thinking about me and my habits and the way I consume media, in fact. I find it really fascinating, and I've delved into this before. This isn't really a new topic for me, but maybe just a continuation of some of the same thoughts that I did in my rant where I talked about that it's okay to like things, and I get kind of bogged down by people always tearing apart certain types of media, certain albums, how everyone kind of comes to this consensus that something's terrible and that we're all going to turn our nose up at it or something, and that there's just such an intense negativity and criticism on the internet that really rubs me the wrong way. And I am very frustrated by how a lot of YouTubers kind of lean on the clickbaity titles and how they want to promote things that are negative, like here's the worst albums, here's the most terrible bands. You know, those types of clickbaity things are just not really what I enjoy talking about, and why I probably won't go there on my YouTube channel of talking about the worst albums, the worst songs by this band, you know, the terrible prog bands, you know, things like that are just not in my wheelhouse, because I just don't think of music that way. I don't even think in a lot of ways that terrible music exists. I mean, music to me and my experience is very largely subjective. And I know there's critics out there who really use objective measurements to critique things like music and other forms of art. And maybe some of that is valid in its own way, but I don't really view myself as a critic. So I don't come to my listening experience very critically minded. I just am looking for things that I enjoy and that I think are worth my time and effort to get into and listen to. And I respect and trust the artist to kind of provide the art that they think is worthwhile of putting out there. And it may not be for me, you know, I may have a favorite artist that puts out a new record and it's just not to my taste. They're experimenting with a style that just isn't my preference, but I'd never say it's a terrible album. I'd say this album's just not for me. It's not in my preferred style. For my tastes and what I like to listen to, it's just not in line, and I'm just going to skip over it for this point in time. But some people take that to mean, oh, it's a terrible album because it's not to my preference. You know, the artist isn't doing what I wish they were doing. And to me, that's kind of immature in a lot of ways. Like, shouldn't we be excited when artists are trying to experiment and go outside of their established style and trying to do something very different? And when it's an artist that I respect, this is how I view things, I trust them to go with the vision that they have for themselves and not just bow down to the pressures of what the masses are saying that they would want. And so that's basically what my experience in music has been, and in a lot of other genres it's very similar, you know, in books and movies and television, you know, that I'm also really into. I find creators that I really love, that I trust and know that have integrity, and I become a fan of theirs and willing to go with them on whatever journey they want to take me on. And if something they release isn't to my preference, I don't automatically say, well, this is terrible and this thing they've created sucks. I just say, well, it just didn't connect with me for whatever reason, but I'm sure there's someone out there that it connects with. Because for me, these types of artists, I trust that they're not going to just release utter crap just because they can, or just because they want to sell out and make money off of it, especially the artists I follow. You know, these are obscure prog artists that are only doing it for the love of the music, because they're not superstars or making tons of money from it in general. In most cases, you know, there might be a few exceptions to that, but you know, for me, at least from what I see, and of course you never know exactly what people are thinking and what they're actually trying to do, but from my perspective, most of the artists that I enjoy and talk about on this channel have a lot of integrity, and they're not just going to release something that they think is just objectively terrible. You know, when they release an album, they obviously like something about it, or they just wouldn't release it, right? Or they wouldn't have spent so much time and effort putting it together. So to say something's just terrible is kind of a weird thing to me that is hard for me to understand. And maybe it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Maybe people are just framing it that way because it's a bit buzzier, when really what they mean is just, these are the albums that don't connect with me or aren't my preference. You know, whatever the case is, but people tend to speak about things in such objective terms that kind of turns me off a little bit. Not my favorite kind of thing to watch or to be a part of, because oftentimes they're tearing apart things that I actually really enjoy and like, and I don't like being told that my taste is terrible and that I love this terrible thing, you know. But you have to always take everything you watch on the internet or that you see from a critic or some other personality with a grain of salt. You know, people are just really giving their opinions. And even if they don't say constantly, like, this is just my opinion, like, that's kind of implied, right? If you're talking on the internet on a channel that talks about music or TV or movies or something like that, it's pretty obvious that you're just giving your own opinions and impressions because, like I mentioned, art is subjective. There's no absolute truth. There's something that one person can consider terrible that another person out there is just absolutely in love with and just finds to be excellent. So there's usually not like this consensus that everyone rises up and decides together that this is objectively something terrible that this artist has done. And sometimes when that seems to happen, that's frustrating for me as well. Like, I've talked about this before, but there's a lot of examples in media of people just all deciding together that this was a terrible thing and that's how they frame it and talk about it, well, you know, all the time. And it just bothers me a lot because some of those things are actually things I enjoy. But anyways, I just find it interesting that I just don't view the world in such absolutes, and I don't harp on things that I don't like. I'm not going to talk over and over about like how I dislike something. This was terrible. What was the artist thinking in this case? If I don't prefer something, if I listen and it doesn't grab me, I just don't listen anymore. I just don't even think about it. I'm like, well, this wasn't for me. Hopefully next time around it will be for me, you know, or I listen to it more to try to understand what the artist was going for. But I think it's just my personality that I tend to latch on to certain artists, certain genres, certain styles, and I tend to just like that style and that artist and tend to just like what's released in that vein. You know, I tend to go in with an optimistic attitude, trying to find the good in everything that I experience. And sometimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes I'm bored by it. Sometimes it just doesn't grab me, or it's actually off-putting to me in some fashion, just not the kind of sound that I find pleasing. But I still don't think that's bad or horrible or terrible music. I just think, well, they went in a different direction and some people really like this and I just don't. It's just not my preference. Like, controversial take, but I was going to do a King Crimson themed month on the channel. I was actually doing monthly artists throughout the months, throughout the first half of the year. But when I got to King Crimson, I was trying to listen through their catalog. I was going to do a ranking episode and such. But I just found that I don't like their music very much. It's just not for me. And I would never say that King Crimson is a terrible band objectively, because I know so many people out there love them for good reason. But it's just not a sound that really connects with my ears for whatever reason. It just sounds a little angular and strange. And, you know, there's moments, there's songs, there's albums that I like from them, but overall it's just not really for me. And it felt like I was spending a lot of time listening to stuff that I just wasn't enjoying. And I don't want that to be what I do on this channel. I don't want to force myself to have to listen to things that just aren't to my taste, just to kind of please the masses, please the people who are asking for these types of things. It's my channel at the end of the day, and I'm not getting paid to do this. It's just my fun passion project. It's just me being able to talk about what I love as a hobby. You know, I have a career very separate from this. So why would I force myself to do things I hate when this is just meant to be a fun expression and a hobby and me sharing my passions and the things that I enjoy with people who are inclined to the similar things? And what I love to do more than anything is to recommend music that I think people will love if they have similar tastes as me. That's why I hope that people are drawn in by my videos of talking about classic prog and notable modern prog bands, showcasing my taste and the things that actually connect with me and that I love. And then you can kind of trust me to recommend you things that are in a similar vein. And I know that not all my recommendations are going to hit for everybody. I've had comments in various reviews of people like, well, this album just does nothing for me. I don't really care for this at all. Some people don't like certain styles. Like sometimes I'll talk about more progressive metal stuff, and there's some people who just can't get into metal. But I'd hope that people don't just think, well, all progressive metal is terrible because I don't like it. That they, understand that there's something good there. There's a reason why so many people like this type of music. It just may not be to your personal preference and taste. So, like I said, this is very much similar to what I've already talked about in a previous episode about, how it's okay to like things and okay also to not like things. It's obviously something I think about a lot. But I just am thinking about it from a slightly different angle, I think, of this idea of clickbait and people talking about things that are horrible and terrible just to get clicks and views, and how I'm just not going to do that on my channel. I tend to focus on more positive things, and I think that's just my personality. And I just find it interesting that I just don't see the world in those terms. I don't ever go into anything that I'm about to experience expecting it to be the worst or terrible or awful. And when I listen to a new album and I'm trying it out, usually it's either like, oh yeah, this is totally something that I'm into and totally enjoy, or it's like, it's just not grabbing me. It's just not worth my time and attention. I'm going to move on. But I'm not going to make a video about like, oh, there's this awful album that I have to tell everyone about how terrible it is. Like, of course not. It just wasn't connecting to me, and I'm not going to waste time listening to music that I think is terrible and awful. You know what I mean? So there's been some recent videos, I guess, to give more context. There's been recent videos from my friends, and I really liked and I watched these videos, so I'm not criticizing anything at all. But I was thinking, because I like to be part of the conversation, I like to also put my take and spin on some of these video topics that kind of go around my group. And the recent one was like terrible albums by great bands. But as I was thinking through that topic, I just realized that all of my favorite bands, I just wouldn't say that they have a terrible album. I wouldn't even know what to point out. And I know there's some of those like classic prog bands that kind of transitioned in the 80s and into the 90s into a little bit of a different style and a different sound. And a lot of people don't like those albums because they liked the style that they had in their prog period in the 70s, and they don't like that bands stylistically changed to something else. But another thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is how different it is back then with those bands than it is with the modern prog scene, because with those classic bands, prog was actually mainstream and popular. These bands were trying to make a living and trying to have mainstream success in prog. Your Yes, your Rush, your Genesis, all those types of bands. It makes sense that in the 80s they totally transitioned and changed their style, because that's what modern music was doing. It was changing into a different style. Progressive rock wasn't favorable anymore, and the bands tried to adapt to a new sound. And in some ways it worked, in some ways it didn't, because of course it was a different sound and style for them. And some maybe sound a bit more awkward in their transition. Some are actually really good for what they are. It's just a different genre and a different style. So I wouldn't call those albums terrible. These transitional albums, I think there's actually a lot to really love and enjoy in these records if you like the style that they're transitioning towards. And I think people confuse the fact that the band just transitioned into a different style and sound that may not be to your preference. Doesn't mean they were making terrible albums. They were just making albums in a different sound and in a different style that may not be as preferable to you as the style that you enjoyed from the 70s. But I don't think the 80s Genesis albums are way worse than their prog period albums. It's just different style albums that are pretty hard to even compare, but are good in their own rights for what they are. So I would just never argue that those are terrible albums just because they were transitioning into a different style that may not be as preferable to my ears. I famously have not really enjoyed a lot of the 80s style music, but I wouldn't say that it's all terrible and awful. I just not my personal preference. I tend to like the classic sound of the 70s material just for my own personal interest and what I enjoy. So it's hard for me to say that those are terrible albums. And the modern bands, the modern prog bands, don't really have the same problem because they never really had that mainstream success to begin with. So they're kind of a niche artist starting out. So they're just continuing in the style that they enjoy, regardless of what the mainstream music world is doing, because they were never mainstream to begin with. So they're staying within their lane and their niche and able to experiment and do things just purely for their own artistic vision. So to me, a lot of these modern bands stay a lot truer to their sound and don't have this big transitional shift. So I think that's why maybe some people think that the newer prog bands are a little bit more consistent. It's because they're basically doing it just from their own artistic vision and passion and not bowing down to like the mainstream music world like a lot of the bands back in the 70s had to do. And so I think it's made for a more consistent sound for bands that are making this style of music nowadays. And so for me, the favored bands that I really love from the modern prog era, the Flower Kings, Spock's Beard, Dream Theater, I just find them to be wildly consistent. And when I love the band and their sound, I really love every album that they're doing because they're not really taking these big, huge stylistic shifts. Maybe some artists do more than others, but for most of the bands I love, I think they really stay true to their core sound, even if they experiment slightly here and there with little different types of things. But to me, it still feels at the core what I come to love the band for, instead of like shifting from the 70s prog style into a totally different 80s pop aesthetic. You know, that's totally stylistically different kind of music. And if you like progressive rock but don't like 80s pop music, you're just not going to like their new albums because it's in a style that you just don't prefer to listen to. It doesn't mean those are terrible albums, just not your preferred style. And I know people are going to say, well, you know, there are actual objectively bad albums out there, you know, and maybe there are. And, you know, you could argue that, and I'm certain that people will make those points. But for me, when I come to like a band, I trust them to make decent, solid album. I'm not saying like every album they release is an A+, like all-star album. Of course, there's a range of like different levels of how strong these albums are. And of course, like I said, there's both subjectivity to that and there's also some objectivity to that, I'm sure. But for me, I just don't focus on the negative aspects. I don't focus on, you know, them and why they made terrible albums and stuff like that. It's just not my thing. So that's a video topic that I just couldn't do. I could say what my least favorite albums from my favorite bands are, and maybe I'll do a show like that. But I would never say that those are terrible albums. It's just, you know, if you're a guy like me that like loves to rank things and order things in their brain, I tend to have kind of at least some kind of a ranking order of all my favorite bands' discographies. And of course, something will sit at the bottom of it, but it's more for reasons that I just can't connect to it as well as I connect to their other albums, or they have a bit of a raw sound on this one and didn't quite dial into what I'd come to love them more for, whatever the case may be. But it's hard for me to make a declarative statement that this is just terrible and a horrible thing, because it's an artist I respect and love, and I don't want to tear them down. And I like when bands and artists experiment, and I like Steven Wilson's To the Bone, Future Bites, and Harmony Codex. I think he's experimenting. It's a little bit stylistically different, and it may not connect with everyone, but it's hard to argue he's not like doing things that he thinks are within his right as an artist and as a creator, and that he feels passionate about, and that he's not releasing crap records just because he can, that he obviously found there to be something really good and valuable about this music that he's crafting and creating. And I, as a consumer, agree and love them as well, and find a lot of that value that he's putting forward. So it just comes down to personal taste and preference, and a lot of it's just how things are framed. Maybe people think similarly to me, but then they talk about it in a way that makes it feel a little bit more negative. And maybe that's just me as a person who's very sensitive to negativity, that I tend to cringe a lot when people are overtly negative and tear things down and tear things apart and say things are horrible and awful. It's just not my vibe. I tend to prefer people who are a bit more positive and try to encourage and try to support artists and talk about what's great about them rather than like all the missteps that they perceive that they made through their career. So just my preference, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not sure this rant's going to actually go out on the channel, but I thought it'd be fun to just get some things off my chest. It's a little bit of a part 2 episode to my prior rant. So if this is out on the channel, hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and I'm sure you'll have some thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know, but be civil and realize that this is just my opinion, and I know there's going to be some dissenters, and that's fine too. So thank you guys for everything and for your support and for being very kind and gracious in the comments and in all interactions that I've had with my subscribers. It's been really great. So thank you guys so much, and I'll hopefully catch you guys in a future episode. Bye everybody.